Think about this. Controlled demolitions cannot be engineered and rigged in a day. It takes months. And therefore, this event must have been planned in advance.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down.
The building is about to blow up. Move it back. We are walking back. There's a building about to blow up.
Did they actually use the word brought down, and who was it that was telling you this?
The fire department, and they did use the word, we're going to have to bring it down.
So what did NIST have to say? Well, it's interesting. NIST didn't bother doing any of that nonsense with the work. Okay? They did something else altogether. They basically said, if you come down to just a little bit above the red, okay, where the dash is just above the red, and it says, found no evidence that would support the melting of steel in a jet-fueled ignited fire in the towers prior to collapse. Okay? The condition of the steel in the wreckage of World Trade Center towers, brackets, whether it was in a molten state or not, was irrelevant to the investigation of the collapse. Okay? So what they're saying is basically this. We didn't really bother studying the steel in the wreckage, whether it was in a molten state or not, because it couldn't provide any information on its condition prior to the collapse. Okay? It's a bit of a funny way of looking at it, if you ask me. If you want to know why something fell down, you still want to examine it, wouldn't you? That's their answer. What else did they say? I've highlighted what I think is the most important bit in red. It says, any molten steel in the wreckage was more likely due to high temperatures, and then the bit in red, resulting from long exposure to combustion within the pile. Okay, what it's saying here is that the reason that they got molten steel was because when it was in the rubble, it was there for a long time. Well, that doesn't make any sense to a physicist, right? Because things don't get hotter than the thing that's heating them. Now, the fires couldn't have been hotter at the bottom in the pile than they were high up in the building, because in the building, obviously, there was lots of oxygen. In the rubble, there would have been very little oxygen. So you would expect the fires to be a lot less. The amount of time of exposure has absolutely nothing to do with it. I mean, this is just nonsense as far as I can see. So anyway, that's what NIST say. So I think, the molten steel question is a good one. But then we come to the last one, the close to freefall collapse. And in a way, this is the most obvious one of all. And anyway, there's another physics teacher, David Chandler, who did the work on this, really, as far as I can gather. And he basically, all he did was he just looked at how fast the rate of collapse of Building 7 was. And as a result of that, he basically got NIST to rewrite their analysis. And they came up with this three-stage collapse, right, which I'll show you. This is a NIST graph, okay? So if you look at the NIST final report on Building 7, this is the graph that they produced. And it's a velocity against time graph. And what they've done, finally, like any competent A-level student would do, is they've actually put a linear fit to the points, something they never did before. Okay? So they put the fit, and that's a red line running through. And then they do a linear regression to that red line. Okay? And you can see there, it's the equation there. And those of you who are more mathematical will see that the gradient is 32.196, because that's the one multiplied by t. Okay? And if I come back a second. So they basically now have a velocity time graph partially fitted with a straight line indicating constant velocity. Okay? Straight line, constant velocity for more than 2 seconds. And the gradient, 32.196 feet per second squared. They do it in imperial. I translate it. 9.8133. Anybody who does physics will know straight away that's g. That's acceleration due to gravity. Okay? So NIST themselves, with this graph, which is in their final report, admit to freefall collapse for more than 2 seconds of what they claim is a 5-second collapse. That 5-second collapse claim is arguable anyway, but even with that, they're saying nearly half of the collapse was at freefall. Now, how can that be? There's a number of ways of looking at this. if you have something that's moving at free fall, that basically means that there can be only one force acting on that object, and that force is its own weight. Okay? So what this is suggesting is that the part of the building is falling with its own weight and nothing's holding it up. How come? Okay? Or we can look at it this way. We can go back to the conservation of energy, and we can say that this could, if we want free fall, this can only occur if all of the gravitational potential energy is converted into kinetic energy as the thing falls. If any energy is needed for other purposes, then the kinetic energy must be reduced, and so the acceleration would fall below free fall rate. But then, if the energy wasn't used for other purposes, what was it that actually destroyed the building? Okay, I'll come back to Bill Manning because he said something else I think that's very relevant. This was one article. It was basically a plea to other experts about what was happening to the investigation, really, if you remember. He's basically saying it's a half-baked farce, what's happened to all the material evidence. And he says, as things now stand, if they continue in such a fashion, the investigation into the World Trade Center fire and collapse will amount to paper and computer-generated hypotheticals. Okay? That's exactly where it got to. Okay? Which is why I said at the start, FEMA and NIST, they just were dealing with physics. Okay? They didn't have a lot of the material, well, FEMA did, but NIST didn't. So what was NIST's final analysis? Well, it relied upon computer simulation. But, amazingly, they didn't actually publicly release what the computer simulation was like. So we know the type of model they used, but we don't know exactly what parameters and so forth they put in. So no one could actually test to see whether NIST results stand up. Why? I mean, where's the national security in this or whatever? This is just a building that collapsed. Surely people should be able to find out. But this is where it stands. Also, for partly the same reason, we've only got certain answers, selected outputs, okay? They've picked out the ones they liked, essentially, okay? And none of those actually reproduce freefall. So they've used a model we don't know, and they've selected their own outputs, and none of those actually explain freefall. So NIST basically can't explain what they are stating happened themselves in their own final report. So I'll come back to, this is Shyam Sundar. He was a lead NIST investigator. And this is what he said to David Chandler when he was challenged at the draft report hearing. He said, free fall happens only when there are no structural components below the building section of the building, the falling section of the building. Absolutely true. I couldn't agree more. And yet, there's free fall in the graph. So, I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you.